America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker, the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation.
And I'm Jordan Bruno, vice president of Job Creators Network.
And you can subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts from. Today, we're joined by Damien Brady. Damien is the Vice President of Research for the National Taxpayers Union Foundation. His responsibilities include producing commentaries and studies on fiscal issues, as well as managing NTUF's Bill Tally program, which tracks the impact of legislation on the size of the federal budget, State of the Union analysis, and much more, which we'll get into. We wanted to have Damien on because of this report that the Treasury Inspector General for the Tax Administration just issued about how the IRS has failed in their goal to audit high net worth individuals, and that they're going to basically they concluded that the examinations were unproductive of these high net worth individuals, likely because they can afford to hire lawyers and accountants to help them get through it, and that they weren't, basically it wasn't a good ROI for them. So they were shifting their examinations to people with $400,000 or more, so sort of lowering the threshold. Damien, thanks so much for joining us on Main Street Matters. I'm so interested in learning about this report, but can you tell us, we've had a colleague of yours on in the past, can you tell us about the National Taxpayers Union Foundation and tell us what you all do there?
Certainly. NTUF is the research arm of the National Taxpayers Union, which is the country's oldest taxpayers lobby group, founded in 1969, I believe, and NTUF was established in the 1970s to provide research and support for the issues that NTU works on behalf of lowering taxes and lowering the burden of government and trying to, we have a task set out for us trying to get the budget towards the path to balance, but we're moving in the wrong direction on that for sure. And I work on a number of issues along with my colleagues about the impacts of tax complexity and our complex tax code, the looking at the budget gimmicks that get used to mask the size of the bills that are being enacted, and other good government and good scorekeeping reforms, and a lot of IRS reform as well too, which bridges into this topic today.
Well, tell us about this report. I know that there's some interesting findings in here that you want to highlight, and I think our listeners will be very interested in hearing about. Yeah,
so the issue in this latest Taxpayer Inspector General for Tax Administration report looks at how the IRS has been conducting its audits of high-income earners over the last couple of years. Started with a directive from the previous Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, who said the IRS should focus on individuals earning $10 million or more. And so they did that for a couple of years, and they set a goal saying the IRS should audit about 8% of these files each year. And they roughly met that goal. And it takes a long time. They only have a limited amount of time to do these, to conduct an audit before the statute of limitations run out. And so they usually run about 18 months or so. So it's a lot of staff hours that go into it. And so then what they found out was they weren't getting the money that they thought that they were going to get. So it turns out that the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. And then we come up to the Inflation Reduction Act, which gave the Internal Revenue Service initially an $80 billion budget boost with the goals of hiring 87,000 new employees at the IRS, including customer service, taxpayer service representatives. But the focus was on enforcement, hiring additional auditors and accountants. And the the idea behind this was that from the information came out from the White House and the Treasury officials who are pushing this, that there's a lot of people who aren't paying their fair share of taxes. So what we're going to do is we're going to beef up the IRS and go after these people and get the money that they're not paying. But as we learned from this report, a lot of the people that they looked at earning $10 million or more were in compliance, and the IRS just was not getting the receipts that they were counting on. So then they switched it, and Secretary of the Treasury Yellen under President Biden set a directive that none of the IRA funding, which is a critical caveat here, they can't use any of the enforcement funding provided in the Inflation Reduction Act to target individuals earning less than $400,000. So, I mean, and it was based on historical averages. But that means that they still can use their base funding that they get every year to continue those efforts. And we found that 63%, so nearly 2/3 of all the new audits initiated in 2023 were on those earning less than the threshold. Because they run into difficulty because, as you noted, a lot of the people higher up on the income scale, they can go out and hire the best attorneys and make sure that they have a really good tax position. So the IRS is kind of failing now. And now they're turning their focus on businesses and small businesses, but going after the job creators.
Wow, it's definitely a scary prospect. So I think you gave a pretty good overview of why the shift, but let me see if I get it right. The shift is essentially the very high net worth individuals are paying for some of the top, they probably have multiple tax lawyers and accountants helping them file, making sure they're in compliance. So there's just really not that much money to be had from these people who are getting the expert help, whereas the average successful small business, you said the threshold is between about 400,000 to that, around that range is now what they're looking for. They don't necessarily can afford that top tier help and are going to be more vulnerable to making mistakes that could result in more funds for the IRS. Is that about right?
Yeah, exactly. They have two programs set up. One is looking at small businesses with incomes of 400,000 to 10 million and those over. And that's where they are focusing a lot of their efforts right now. They also had a separate program geared towards large businesses. And that also turns up with a high rate of no change audits. So the IRS puts a lot of staff hours into these audits. And of course, then the taxpayer has to put a lot of time and effort to defend their position. And then you get through the end of it, and a lot of these people are in compliance, or if there were some differences, the IRS wasn't collecting a whole lot of additional expenses. So that means they have revenue targets that they're supposed to be achieving per the requirements of the Inflation Reduction Act. It was all this enforcement funding was included in that to help bring in new tax revenues. So as they're running into walls going after some of the higher income people, everybody else is going to have to look out because they might be coming for you next.
Right.
If you remember back to when they were working on the Build Back Better Act, which then became the Inflation Reduction Act, one of the early proposals in there was to have basically every single financial institution report information to the IRS if the incoming and outgoing account thresholds exceeded $600. So if you're using a checking account, you would easily have gotten swept up in that net. And thanks to a lot of pushback, that was dropped from the plan. But, that's kind of the mindset behind what went into the funding for the Inflation Reduction Act. It was enforcement first. And if you look back at the document that the White House put out in support of this plan, hardly any mention of the words taxpayer services, customer services, or taxpayer rights, but enforcement was drilled throughout the paper.
Can you give our listeners a little overview of what the demographic then looks like? I mean, is it your sole proprietor who's a professional, or is it, is it the corner store? What are the demographic of this new targeted people they're going after? They
call us small businesses. So anyone making $400,000 or more, And it could be people who are sole proprietors who are filing through the individual income tax. I think that's really where they're trying to focus as well. But then also one area that they've been trying to beef up their enforcement on are partnerships, which can have very complex arrangements, and the IRS has been struggling on how to deal with that, because that part of the tax law and the tax regulations associated with that are extremely complex.
Let me ask you a question. So this enforcement revenue is kind of the idea of getting speeding tickets. You know, the local police stations, they rely on speeding tickets to bring revenue in, right? And so we all know the deal. When it's the end of the month, they're trying to give as many tickets out as possible to increase their revenues. So this is the idea, is to raise revenues off of people who may have made mistakes on their taxes, and they were targeting the wealthy, figuring they weren't paying their fair share, found that in fact they were paying their fair share, or had lawyers to make sure that they had taken every single exemption that was, due to them. So if they're now targeting small businesses, which is what we all said back then, this is all about targeting small businesses. I think their argument is, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, then why should this be a big deal? I mean, you just have to pay all your tax, make sure that you're not trying to cheat the government, right? That's kind of their argument. But that kind of falls flat when you start to look at what happens to somebody. Can you tell our listeners, like, what happens when a small business owner gets that notice for an audit, from a time perspective to potentially the costs involved in that, and ultimately what a small business owner ends up having to do as a result?
Yeah, certainly. So, the focus of this all is to get money, and they're coming in with the mindset that people are willfully hiding income, and a lot of language about tax cheats and people not paying their fair share. So, of course, there are some people who are willfully doing that, but another part of the problem is just a lot of confusion about tax obligation. So then, it is the one point of holding audits is just to make sure that people are in compliance. So even if you have a lot of no change rates, it just, reminds people that the IRS is looking, but they should be targeting better. And if there's a lot of no change rates, there's things that they can do to lessen the burden. Because when you get that notice from the IRS, that's a lot of fear and intimidation, especially knowing the mindset that's been drilled into this agency from the top down over the last couple of years, is that there's a lot of people out there who aren't paying their money. So if you're wealthy, you can go out and hire some of the best attorneys, tax representatives to make sure that you are clean through the audit. And we've seen that happen a lot. And the IRS often takes a very aggressive position. A lot of these cases end up in court and get litigated, go to tax court. And, one famous case recently was the IRS vastly overestimated the value of Michael Jackson's estate. And that was a huge fight that went on for years. And the IRS lost out on that one. So a lot of times they'll take a heavy-handed approach, or leaning on the taxpayer. And the taxpayer goes through a lot of frustration and anxiety. And of course, there's a lot of out-of-pocket expenses and time that goes into that just diverts focus away from conducting businesses. And we already have, with inflation and a lot of the regulations from state governments and from the federal government, the cost of business is just going up. And so this is just another thing for honest taxpayers to have to worry about.
What is the no change rate? What do you mean by that?
Certainly. So that means the IRS goes in thinking there's going to be a lot of additional money that wasn't accounted for when a taxpayer filed. So then they'll spend hours and hours and hours and over months and months reviewing a person's audit. And then when they come through at the end, there's not much change in the amount that the taxpayer owed. So they go through that whole process. And basically, maybe the taxpayer will owe a little bit more. It could be higher if the wealthier people, there's opportunities there where the swing will be higher. But in general, we're seeing a lot of no change rates. That means taxpayer comes through and roughly they were in compliance with the law. Or in the IRS, if they were able to get additional money, then there's some questions of whether it was worth the staff hours at the IRS that went into that whole process.
I think what's so scary about that notice when the IRS is coming for that audit is in the court of law, in our criminal system, you are innocent until proven guilty. And in the IRS, when they come to you, you are guilty until you prove yourself innocent. I think that's
exactly
what people are afraid of.
Yeah, and there's a lot of intimidation involved with it, and a lot of negative stories over the years about the way taxpayers are treated. So, we really want to make sure that taxpayer rights are front and center of this whole process. And that's we've been working on a project called Taxpayers First, which stands for Taxpayers for IRS Transformation. And the idea of this is we gathered an advisory board of people from across the spectrum, various think tanks, right of center, left of center, and then professionals in the field and former IRS agents, and saying, okay, the IRS got this infusion of money, $80 billion, which was reduced to $60 billion through some rescissions. But how can we best position the IRS to use this money most effectively to help taxpayers to improve its operations and make sure that we're protecting taxpayer rights?
Damien, let's broaden the conversation a little bit. For years, conservatives have warned about the threat of our massive federal debt. And we said that once interest rates go up back to historical norms, it's going to balloon the deficit. And that's exactly what's happened. If I read it right, the deficit this year is expected to be higher than the entire defense budget. So now, from my reading, the pro-tax and the leftists are responding to that, saying, "Okay, it is now a problem, but the problem now is that we're not taxing enough. So the way to deal with the deficit and the debt is to massively raise taxes." How would you respond to the argument that that our fiscal crisis is a result of too little tax revenues?
If you look back at the historical average of government receipts over the past 24 years, there's been different tax rates over the years, but on average, the government is collecting in 17 to 18% of GDP, and it goes back even further than the year 2000. That's been roughly the average. There's some fluctuations depending on the economy and other situations that come up. That ought to be the target for our spendings. We know we're roughly going to get 18% of GDP in revenues, but unfortunately, spending is coming in this year, I believe, at 24% of GDP. So that is a huge fiscal gap that we're passing along down to a next generation of taxpayers. Just simply put, it's too much overspending. And yeah, you noted the deficit for this year, and the Congressional Budget Office, which is Congress's fiscal watchdog, keeps an eye on these sorts of things, put out an update of its budget outlook, and the deficit ballooned by $400 billion just since February when they originally did their report. And the reason for this was actions by the Biden administration to transfer student loan debt from the borrowers onto taxpayers. That's a big part of the increase in the deficit that we saw, $400 billion in total, a lot of that from the student loan program. And then the other part is that Congress enacted a pretty large appropriations bill providing funding for Ukraine and Israel and the Pacific Ocean area. So a lot of unchecked spending. That's something to be mindful of when we're heading into next year, facing the expiration of a lot of the provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And the background of that is we have a huge deficit. So some people are looking at the numbers on the TCJA and saying, wow, if we extend the tax cuts, that's going to be a $3.5 trillion cost to the government over the next 10 years. We can also look at that and say, if we don't extend these tax cuts, that's a $3.5 trillion hit on taxpayers were already reeling under inflation.
So Job Creators Network was really involved in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act fight. What our members have told us is the couple of the provisions that have really helped them is the 20% immediate deduction, and then also the immediate 20% deduction, and then also the immediate expensing. Both of those, as you mentioned, expire at the end of next year. Again, I'm seeing the groundwork daily, almost the daily drip of media and research saying that, oh, we can't afford to extend these because of our fiscal situation. But in your analysis and expertise, what really would be the effect of extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act fiscally?
Yeah, the provisions that you pointed out were very key and important provisions of the TCJA that helped spur a lot of the economic growth that we were seeing. It's one of the untold stories of the TCJA is that, in addition to giving people a tax break that then helped grow the economy until COVID hit, but it also actually made the tax code more progressive by increasing the standard deduction and some of the other changes. There's a lot of people on the lower income who were relieved of an income tax burden, and then more of the burden overall shift to higher income earners. So by extending that, especially the key business provisions that you mentioned, that will help keep our economy growing. And I mean, that should be the focus. We need really good pro-growth tax policy coming out of Washington. A lot is going to depend on the results of the election to see who's in the White House, who's running the Senate, who's running the House, and then figure out a way to proceed so we can get some good tax policy. But it's all up in the air at this point. But a lot of people are laying the groundwork on the reasons that you pointed out why it's so important to continue these tax cuts, and then also find sensible ways to restrain spending so that way we're not just piling onto the debt for future generations.
Just curious if the IRS needs to raise more money to pay for all the increased spending, because we all know when they say we're going to cut spending, what they really mean is they're going to cut the increase in the rate of spending on the next budget. And I think that's kind of lost on Americans when they start talking about these terrible cuts to some program. There's really no cutting happening. It's just they're not going to increase it as much, right? So if the IRS needs to raise some more money to pay for spending, where do you think they should look? I mean, where's the best place to go? Because they seem to always head for the middle class and our small business owners.
Yeah, so there's another issue here that makes it harder for the IRS to collect the money that it was expected to collect with the Inflation Reduction Act. There had plans of hiring 87,000 new employees, and so this included customer service reps, but a lot of accountants and auditors. They are falling far short of their hiring goals for that. And one issue is that there's a shortage in the pipeline of accountants coming out of colleges and universities now to fill all the needed positions in the field. So that means when the IRS is going out and trying to hire these people, get the best people to work for the government, they're in fierce competition with private sector firms like Ernst & Young and other accounting firms who have a lot more money that they would be able to offer and more flexibility. So that's another issue in the background here too, to think about all this. And so what we've suggested is, since they aren't meeting their hiring goals, and we're running into so many no change audits on a lot of the high income people where they thought they were going to be able to squeeze more revenue out of, what they ought to do is take some of this enforcement money that they got in the Inflation Reduction Act. There's about $20 billion left. Use that to modernize their systems and their processes. The IRS operates the oldest database across the federal government. The individual master file, which is the core processing unit for all taxpayer data, dates back to assembly language, whatever that is, but from the early 1960s. It's archaic technology. And they've been struggling for decades and decades and decades to finally get to the 21st century. And we're now a quarter of the way into the 21st century, and they're still lagging behind on this modernization effort. So they ought to be using more of this enforcement money for that. And that would lead to some efficiencies within the IRS and make it easier for them to help taxpayers. So, for example, they manage at least 60 different case management systems. So that means when you call into the IRS and you're able to get through to a live person, they might not have access to that case system. So by failing to modernize their individual master file, all these other projects are lagging. So they really need to be prioritizing. Another thing that they can do is improve taxpayer services. So that way, when you call up, you're more likely to talk to a live person. They can do better training of their employees. So that way they can answer more questions for taxpayers. Currently, there are large sections of the tax code that are declared out of scope for customer service. So if you call in, they'll just refer you to go to your website. And that's why so many people pay for out-of-pocket tax preparation services, either a software or experts like H&R Block or other firms that are out there.
I was going to ask, how do you think like how is the direct filing working out?
That's an issue there. It was developed in secret. They did not get congressional authorization to create this program, so they've kind of gone rogue on it. It's a little troubling.
Can you take a step back first for our audience and explain what it is?
Yeah, certainly.
Okay.
So the Inflation Reduction Act earmarked $15 million for the IRS to study how it can design a program where taxpayers would be able to file directly with the Internal Revenue Service. So they produced that study, and it came out with a range of estimates depending on the scope of the program, how many taxpayers it would serve. Could cost anywhere from $100 to over $400 million a year. So then IRS Commissioner Werfel was called before the House and the Senate Finance Committees to answer some questions about the IRS. And he was asked about this and what the IRS is going to do with the study. And he said, we're taking it under consideration on what we're going to do with the direct file. We'll let you know when something happens. But it turns out, in the meantime, they were secretly developing this program already, even though it didn't have congressional authorization. They put $140 million into it so far, and the cost estimate is incomplete. It was developed as a pilot program across a limited number of states. Taxpayers with relatively simple tax situations would be able to file directly with the IRS. And so that the pilot period ended. I listened to a stakeholder webinar that the IRS held with public accountants and some people in the media. And one thing that struck me is, they're talking about how many people used it. 140,000, I believe, were able to file through it. And they were very excited as they watched the number of refund claims going up every year. That made them very happy. And to me, I'm looking at that and saying, okay, people are getting money back, but that just means that they had too much withheld throughout the year. So that's another problem that I have with this program. So now they're going to roll it out across the states. I think it's been a diversion from some of the other modernization programs that they should be using. And the IRS already operates something called the Free File Alliance, which is a public-private partnership with several tax preparation firms. And that saw a huge spike in users this year. I believe it was over 1 million people were able to use that. And that's something that directly saves administrative expenses at the IRS. And by them creating a direct file system, that's additional administrative costs. And then there's the intimidation factor of the IRS is going to be the one. Their job is to maximize the revenues coming into the government. Are you going to want to trust them to do your taxes for you, or are you going to go out and hire somebody? I think unless your tax situations are very simple, you're going to go out and find someone who's going to make sure that you are getting all the tax breaks and benefits that you are eligible for.
Damien, my last question is in an attempt to hopefully finish on some good news. This has been a pretty distressing conversation for small businesses. If Republicans can win all three branches, or this House, Senate, and presidency, what is a blue sky scenario for pro-growth, conservative tax reform that could possibly happen next year?
We would see something very much like the TCJA, some good pro-growth positions. And, as you implement more and more policies that help grow the economy, that lessens the cost of it to a degree by generating more jobs. I mean, that's hardly enough to offset a major portion of it, but that is helpful. But then on the flip side, Congress is going to have to look at the spending side and make sure that we're not piling on additional debt. But if that was the case, if all the branches went to the Republicans, I think we would be in good shape for tax reform. The spending side is going to be tricky.
But not the elimination of the income tax like Trump said last week.
Oh, no, he floated an idea of replacing the income tax with tariffs, which is, I think he was just kind of brainstorming, but I think people will, around him who know better will say that'd be a terrible idea. It would be extremely regressive. So let's work on the system that we have and make it better and more fairer rather than implementing tariffs, which would impact all sectors of the economy and be extremely regressive.
Well, Damien, how can people go and find more about the National Taxpayers Union Foundation?
Sure. Our website is ntu.org.
ntu.org. Well, Damien, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. And thank you all for taking the time to listen. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. Please subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcast from. And we'll be back soon with another episode. Bye for now.